Social Science, Section 2, Healthcare from the 1st century CE to the Scientific Revolution. Reason, Secularism, and Interpreting the Greeks as the founders of the Western tradition. The Western tradition of healthcare is typically traced to a period of Greek life sometimes referred to by historians as the Greek Miracle or the Greek Enlightenment, that occurred around the 5th century BCE. Extraordinary works of philosophy emerged at this time concerning issues central to the nature of human existence, from the public or political body to the fundamental nature of the natural or biological body. When the Greeks voluntarily organized themselves into city-states, Greece became the first democratic society of the Western world, and the only one until the modern period. This organizational system produced a wealth of scholarly works on the political nature of human societies and how forms of government and public speech, rhetoric, could be used or abused to liberate or tyrannize the populace. In their study of the natural world, including studies of medicine, many Greek thinkers prioritized the use of reason and close observation and independent inquiry. These thinkers also regarded individuals and societies rather than gods and the divine as the most important elements of their work. The Greek Enlightenment came to characterize much of what Western society would come to see as praiseworthy and exceptional about itself. Recently, scholars have questioned the extent of this exceptionalism, particularly as Greek ideas and ways of seeing the world circulated and shared common themes with ideas from other cultures and civilizations. Greece did not, in other words, emerge in isolation as an intellectual force, but European scholars in the medieval and early modern periods, who laid the foundation for the global dominance of Western culture and philosophy, found inspiration in ancient Greek authority. It is because of the centrality of these later scholars that Greek works and ideas continue to be widely read today, well over 2,000 years later, despite their commonalities with other ancient cultures. For the Greeks and their immediate cultural and intellectual heirs, the Romans, health was interpreted as a matter of individual circumstance and local conditions. There are few accounts from the ancient Greek world that are exceptions to this or that describe in detail widespread or epidemic disease. One very important exception can be found in the account of Plague of Athens, 430 BCE, included in the history of the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, written by the Athenian general Thucydides, circa 460 to circa 400 BCE. It is to Thucydides, in fact, that we owe the word history, as he described his writings as a type of inquiry, the Greek word for this being historia. At the heart of Thucydides' inquiry lay the discernment of the causes and outcomes of this war fought between the powerful Athenians and their allies against those allies who came to the aid of the city-state of Sparta. According to Thucydides, the reason Athens provoked and lost the war was essentially due to the fundamental state of human nature, which tended to overreach into hubris when in the thrall of too great a sense of personal invulnerability. It was for this reason that Thucydides wrote what would become one of the most quoted phrases of history when he said, "War is a violent teacher." It gives most people impulses that are as bad as their situation when it takes away the easy supply of what they need for daily life. Thucydides' methods of historia included using first-hand accounts, close eyewitness observation, and detailed case histories, lessons he learned from the contemporary philosophers of his age, Hippocrates in particular. Thucydides' descriptions of the plague outbreak are detailed and vivid, and their purpose in the Historia is to lay bare the effects of environmental strife on human nature. Dead and dying lay tumbling on top of one another in the street, and at every water fountain lay men half dead with thirst. The temples also, where they pitched their tents, were all full of bodies of those who died in them, for people grew careless of holy and profane things alike, since they were oppressed by the violence of the calamity and did not know what to do. And so, because they thought their liver and their property were equally ephemeral, they justified seeking quick satisfaction in easy pleasures. But the pleasures of that moment, and whatever contributed to that, were set up as standards of nobility and usefulness. No one was held back in awe, either by fear of the gods or by laws of men. Not by the gods, because men concluded it was all the same whether they worshipped or not, seeing as they all perished alike, and not by the laws because no one expected to live till he was tried and punished for his crimes. Once again, we see how rationalist and secularist approaches to inquiry among Greek authors could share common interests and themes despite the wide variety of topics they investigated. Speculative thought and rigorous observation were the dual strands of Greek questions about the status and place of humans in a wider universe. Thucydides said of his own efforts, "Those who want to look into the truth of what is done in the past, which, given the human condition, will recur in the future, either the same fashion or nearly so, those readers will find this history valuable enough, as this was composed to be a lasting possession and not to be heard for a prize at the moment of a contest." It was, in other words, written in the hope that future generations might diagnose what ailed them and understand better their instincts for harm of the self and others, so the misery of Athens could become a lesson for people throughout time. Greek medicine in the Roman Empire. To understand what changed, or did not change, about ideas of health and medicine at the beginning of the first millennium, it is important to consider the life and work of the 2nd century physician Galan of Pergamon. It was primarily Galen's version of Greek and Roman medicine, theory, and practice that dominated the medieval interpretation of health and disease. Therefore, we will first consider the differences in healthcare between the Roman and the earlier Greek traditions, before turning to a discussion of the medieval period and its practical demise during the Black Death. Galan of Pergamon, the Roman Hippocrates. Along with Hippocrates, Galan is often venerated in the history of the Western medical tradition as one of its chief architects. Unlike Hippocrates and the Hippocratics, however, whose works did not come to be organized as a collection of works, a corpus, until some 400 years after they were written, the writings of Galan were self-consciously directed at creating a legacy for his own views of health and disease. Galan provides another instructive example of the importance of medical pluralism and the ongoing effect it had on the motives and styles of writing in medical scholarship. Like Hippocrates, Galan was writing for an audience of his contemporary critics and competitors, and to a much greater extent than even the most argumentative of the Hippocratics, on tradition in medicine and the sacred disease. Galen's work shows a marked determination to undermine the ideas of others in order to stamp his own identity on reputable, learned medicine. Galan was extremely successful on both counts, and his work and views of medical theory and practice dominated the Western tradition for about 15 centuries. There are other reasons for Galen's lasting influence too, such as the fact that he wrote a lot. His works, unlike many others from ancient world that survived only as fragments, stayed largely, but not wholly, intact from the time that they were written, which helped to establish his historical legacy. The forceful and compelling way in which Galan compiled existing medical thought in order to complement his own view of what the theory and practice of medicine was, or was not, and should be, or should not be, is the primary reason why the medicine discussed in Section 2 and most of Section 3 of this resource guide is Galenic medicine. Like Hippocrates, Galan came from a prosperous and cosmopolitan community, in the vicinity of an Asclepion erected by the cult of Asclepius. Galan was born in the city of Pergamon, or Pergamum, then part of the Roman Empire in Asia Minor, and now the city of Bergama, Turkey, sometime in the year 129 CE. Due in part to his proximity to the Asclepion, Galan was strongly influenced by the business of medicine from early childhood. Other aspects of Galan's early life set him apart from Hippocrates and other historical figures. The historian of ancient medicine, Vivian Nutton, tells us that the wealth and influence of Galan's family allowed him to receive an unusually protracted and comprehensive education. His career had apparently been chosen for him after Asclepius appeared to Galan's father in a dream during a visit to the local Asclepion and informed him of his son's destiny. Family wealth allowed Galan to study not only in Pergamon, but also quite extensively across the intellectual centers of the Roman Empire. The emergence of empires brought about many changes, including new disease phenomena, and granted the affluent greater opportunities to move around vast new regions of the known world in search of knowledge, ideas, and prospects. Galan was of a social class and gender that allowed him to take advantage of these opportunities and thrive. Galan's early education included a comprehensive immersion in Greek philosophy, which, as the historian Vivian Nutton argues, nurtured in Galan the confidence in his rhetoric and logical skills that he would later use so effectively against his critics and competitors. His education was not simply a means to hone his skills of reason and disputation, however. For Galan, there was simply no other way into the practice of medicine than through the study of philosophy. Since Galan regarded his own knowledge of Greek philosophy superior to that possessed by any other, he felt justified in claiming that he, and only he, could read and perfectly understand the works of the master physician, Hippocrates. Significantly, Galen's elevation of Hippocrates to the status of master physician was a strategy to celebrate the achievements and protect the legacy of Galan himself. As Nutton argues, it is not only that Galan found within the Hippocratic corpus evidence to justify and approve what he himself wishes to do. He also imposed on his hero theories, beliefs, and practices that he is unlikely to have shared. Some of these notions he undoubtedly gained from his own teachers: the theory of the four humors, the theory of prognosis, and a holistic approach to an individualist's therapy. But Galan may have gone far beyond them in his creation of an unerring Hippocrates in his own image. One clear example of an imposed idea was Galen's insistence that the Hippocratics practiced dissection, a claim for which there is scant evidence. Rather, it is likely that Galan was influenced by the experimental works of the Alexandrian physicians Herophilus and Aristotle, who are known for the practice of human dissection. After the conquest of northern Egypt by Alexander the Great, the city of Alexandria was founded to serve as a beacon of culture, knowledge, and power. As a result, for a brief period, Alexandria became one of the few places in the ancient world where human dissection and even vivisection was temporarily permitted. Herophilus and Aristocrates obtained permission from the king Ptolemy I to operate on the bodies of condemned Egyptian prisoners. At that time, Greek custom largely considered it taboo to cut open the human body in order to investigate its contents. However, Egyptians who were still practicing mummification around 300 BCE already, in the mind of the Greeks, desecrated their dead. The work of the Alexandrians survives only in fragments, but that their work survives at all is largely due to Galan, assiduously recorded all he could find within his own writing. For Galan, the works of Aristocrates and Herophilus rationalized and justified his own claims to have dissected human remains, but there is good reason to be skeptical of Galan in this regard. We should understand his claim as more rhetorical and designed to persuade rather than as reflection of his actual research. Taboos against dissection in the ancient world were quite strong. To understand more fully why dissection was of such great philosophical importance to Galan, it is important to consider the wider context of Greek philosophy that so influenced him. The influence of Greek philosophy on Galen's views of Hippocratic medicine. In addition to Hippocrates and the Alexandrians, Galan was also a great admirer of the two greatest philosophical titans of the Greek Enlightenment period, Plato, 428 to 347 BCE, and Plato's student Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. Both Plato and Aristotle shared a teleological view of nature, a word derived from the Greek telos meaning end, goal, or purpose, and logos meaning reason or explanation, hence the ubiquitous modern suffix of ology attached to those words involving the study of or reason or about the world. Teleology in Platonic and Aristotelian thinking held that the laws of nature governing the universe were fixed and could be known through the application of certain philosophical methods of logical inquiry. These were ideas that Galan warmly embraced. Another related aspect of the model of a teleological universe proposed by both Plato and Aristotle, albeit in different ways, was the central role for a rational creator, an entity referred to as the demiurge by Plato and the prime mover by Aristotle. For all three men, the concept of a rational universal design by a prudential creator allowed for and required systematic and rational inquiry about the nature of the universe. Here the Platonic and Aristotelian ways of thinking diverged sharply, and Galan, for reasons that should become obvious, was much more attracted to the ideas of Aristotle than of Plato. At this point, a digression into Greek philosophy might seem both off-topic and off-kilter, chronologically speaking. Aren't we done with the Greeks by now? But it's a digression that should hopefully provide some useful context for understanding just what was at stake for Galen's anatomically centered views of medical theory and practice, and why he pushed his views so vigorously. It is, after all, difficult to overstate how important Plato and Aristotle were to the scholarship of the medieval period. Plato's work focused on those aspects of the universe that ordered and influenced the world, but not in direct, tangible ways. For Plato, true reality existed in the realm of ideas. He described the ideal types or forms of entities as real, unchanging essences of those we could normally only perceive in corrupted or shadow forms in the observable world. This includes ideals of triangles and other geometric shapes, ideals of love and beauty, and ideals of justice and truth. One of the best demonstrations of Plato's theory of forms is his famous metaphor of the cave. In his allegory, Plato describes humanity as a group of cave dwellers who have only ever witnessed the two-dimensional reality represented by shadows on the cave walls cast by a flickering firelight. When a philosopher rescuer comes into the cave and informs the cave dwellers of the world beyond the cave dwellers are hesitant and afraid to be shown the true light of the sun, and afraid of what they will lose in leaving the cave behind. A rational perspective means to see by the light of the sun, to develop the philosophical mind and perceive the true reality represented by Plato's ideal forms. It involves the dialectical method of inquiry, in which higher truth, that is, truth which is stable, unchanging, is acquired through reasoned dialogue. Dialectical reasoning was developed by Plato's own teacher, Socrates, and almost all of Plato's works are written in the forms of dialogues featuring Socrates as the principal speaker to demonstrate various styles of argument, reason, and response. To be clear, though, dialectic is not rhetoric in the sense of speech aimed at persuasion. It is rather speech directed towards the work of reason. Whereas in Plato's system, true knowledge was accessed through reasoned thought alone, rejecting physical reality as the basis of rational inquiry, Aristotle devised a philosophical system centered entirely on observation and practical knowledge. Although it might appear that the two approaches were diametrically opposed, they shared the same teleological outlook, the same goals, directed at uncovering and explaining the unseen laws and forces of the universe. For each of them, this was the greatest of all human endeavors and the ultimate aim of the ethical philosophy. The practical nature of Aristotle's inquiries was driven not by a love of empiricism, but by a love of knowledge and the belief that knowledge would come from a rigorous examination of things, like and unlike, in order to discover connections and common characteristics. Aristotle called these characteristics universals, and, like the Platonic forms, they were true reality, eternal, unchanging, and unseen except through rational inquiry and philosophical explication. For Plato, the law of forms connected things that were otherwise apparently unconnected because natural laws, once discovered, indicated that what was true for one type of phenomenon must be true for others also. Plato's anatomical description of the human body in Timaeus, for example, is a three-part system of soul ordered around a hierarchy of reason, intellect, in the head, spirit, emotion, in the chest, and desire, appetite, in the gut. In Plato's Republic, this same tripartite division of soul into reason, emotion, and appetite is recast as the universal laws that drive all human action and are applied to the organization of an ideal city. At the head of the ideal city is the philosopher king, who governs the city by reason. The next layer is made up of those with courage to defend and protect the city, the fierce but emotional soldiers. Lastly comes the populace, the ordinary people and their tendencies, according to Plato, to be unstable and at the mercy of their appetites. For Plato, the work of the philosopher in governing the city shared many features with the physician attempting to restore and maintain health in the individual patient. Both sought a balance between opposing and disruptive forces, like untamed appetites and emotions. Plato considered health and good order to be strongly analogous. Potential sources of conflict existed in all aspects of human nature, and managing those effectively could provide both individuals and societies with the freedom necessary for greatness and the fulfillment of the human potential. Like his teacher Plato, Aristotle also saw the theory and practice of medicine as the basis of and a natural analogy to all manner of other phenomena. For Aristotle and his students, this idea drove vast projects in empirical investigation, ranging from topics as diverse as politics and ethics to mineralogy, botany, psychology, and animal dissection. Just as Demiurge made possible and necessary Plato's linking of universal laws as based in the forms were themselves forged by the Demiurge specifically to give rise to the set of intrinsic principles or laws. So too did the prime mover give the Aristotelians reason and purpose to uncover the underlying forces responsible for shaping the world by identifying universals. Universals were the essential features of life and the physical universe that were shared by all entities. Nature, as Aristotle famously stated in the dissection-based treatise Parts of Animals, does nothing in vain. The answer was already there, waiting to be found, and for Aristotle it was up to the philosopher to find it. It was within this style of Aristotelian project that Galan placed himself. Galan devoted his life to identifying Aristotelian order and uncovering divine purpose through teleological studies of anatomy. If all anatomical structures held the secrets of their purpose and their design, what choice was there but to pick up the scalpel and cut? Nothing about Galen's anatomical investigations were peripheral to his philosophical projects of research. Both his anatomical studies and his philosophy of healing were motivated by a voracious desire to know the universal truths that tied all individual instances of disease to a yet unknown and unimagined reality of ultimate and eternal truth. Anatomy, in more prosaic ways, also provided Galan with a bridge between the theoretical and empirical areas of his work, as well as a useful position from which he could confront and condemn others. The major medical sects of Galen's time were represented by three main groups. The rationalists or dogmatists, so called because they reasoned or speculated about unseen or hidden causes for health and disease; the empirics, who preferred direct observation and experience and collected patient case histories for philosophical speculation about hidden causes; and the Methodists, who got their name from their insistence that the method of medicine was grounded in common sense and could be taught to anyone with 6 months to spare. Although the three groups were subjected to Galen's public scorn in person and on paper, it was the Methodists for whom Galan reserved some of his most vitriolic comments. As a historian of medicine, Roy Porter put it, for Galan, the only type of medical practitioner worthy of the name should be educated in the three major branches of philosophy: logic, the discipline of thinking; physics, the science of nature; and ethics, the science of action. In Galen's view, the rationalists lacked action, empirics lacked thought, and Methodists denigrated the dignity of learned medicine itself. For Galan, medicine and philosophy were natural allies, and the bridge between them was an anatomical one. Another example of Galen's idiosyncratic reading of Hippocratic writings is his heavy emphasis on the theory of the four humors. While descriptions of the humors and discussion of their role in health and disease can certainly be found in the original Hippocratic works, those descriptions are not nearly as coherent or extensive as Galan might have us believe. Elevating the status of humoral theory in the Hippocratic tradition was critical to Galan, however, as this allowed him to join his philosophical theories with practical therapeutics. What this meant in terms of humoral medicine was that Galan could now provide reason and justification for certain types of intervention in order to correct the imbalances of humors that bodies experienced in ill health. Most notably, Galan developed elaborate theories and practices surrounding the bloodletting technique known as venesection, slicing and bleeding a vein, enshrining it as the core part of Western medical tradition until the 19th century. This aspect of Galen's work, the part that modified it or retold the legacies of previous authors, is important to emphasize because it shows the ways in which, then as now, discussion of historical figures is often idealized in order to serve some argument or purpose important to the latter period in which the discussion is taking place. For Galan, idealizing Hippocrates allowed Galan to claim authority, prestige, and historical precedence not only, and rather dubiously, in dissection, the study of which underpinned his theories of medicine, but also venesection, which underpinned his practice. For all his bookishness, Galan appears to have been exceptionally gifted in the practice of medicine. Pergamon was home to a large asclepion as well as a large amphitheater that regularly hosted all manner of popular entertainment, including gladiatorial combat. As a physician to the Pergamon gladiators, Galan entered a high-stakes world with slim margins for error or failure. Famous gladiators, after all, attracted big crowds and so were worth a great deal of money to important people. People so important, even a man as socially well-connected as Galan would be loath to cross them. Buoyed by his successful early career spent caring for gladiators, a confident Galan moved to the heart of the empire, the city of Rome, in midlife. It was there that he pursued public disputes with the leading physicians of the time. Using his formidable knowledge of anatomy and skill in dissection, Galan at times turned these disputes into public spectacles. Galan describes such an event in his treatise on examinations by which the best physicians are recognized, translated by historian Heinrich von Staden. Once I attended a public gathering where men had met to test the knowledge of physicians. I performed many anatomical demonstrations before the spectators. I made an incision in the abdomen of an ape and exposed its intestines. Then I called upon the physicians who were present to replace them back in position and to make the necessary abdominal sutures, but none of them dared to do this. We ourselves then treated the ape, displaying our skill, manual training, and dexterity. Furthermore, we deliberately severed many large veins, thus allowing the blood to run free, and called upon the elders of the physicians to provide treatment, but they had nothing to offer. We then provided treatment, making it clear to the intellectuals who were present that physicians who possess skills like mine should be in charge of the wounded. We can see then that Galan was not in any sense a modest man. His appetite for fame and recognition seemed insatiable. He rose to become personal physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and continued in his service to the imperial court after the emperor's death. At the same time, Galan was also a man of incredible talent and skill. Both aspects of his personality were critically important to cement his legacy for the ages. The historian of science Philip van der Eyck, has described the extent of such persuasive influence and how it has been a relatively recent realization for modern scholars that they are not immune to that influence. Van der Eyck argues that by canonizing, compiling many different works into ideas from different places, periods, and authors into a supposedly unified and definitive authoritative source, ancient scholars, particularly Galan, continue to shape assumptions and perspectives of medical history today. The canonization of Hippocrates is the most obvious case in point. As van der Eyck points out, the creation of the Hippocratic corpus hundreds of years after the life of Hippocrates has led to a long history of scholarly interpretation that assumed a central place for Hippocrates as the isolated original starting point for the Western medical tradition. A note on the Hippocratic Oath and medical ethics of Galan. For a man as devoted to presenting himself as the embodiment of the Hippocratic ideal as Galan was, we might expect a discussion from him of the work now synonymous with the Hippocratic tradition itself, namely the code of ethical conduct known as the Hippocratic Oath. However, such a discussion is absent from Galan's work. This is not to say that Galan was not concerned with ethics. In fact, he did make use of other Hippocratic writings to outline his version of Hippocratic ethics, and then used that standard to measure himself favorably and his opponents unfavorably. Which begs the question, why the omission of the oath? Like the famous dictum to first do no harm to the patient, found elsewhere in the Hippocratic writings, the oath contains several directives concerning the appropriate attitudes and behaviors necessary for the practice of medicine. These include such requirements as honesty, confidentiality, and beneficence, the intention to do good. However, the Hippocratic Oath has a rather complicated history and so a rather complicated legacy. For instance, it tends to receive more focus at times of plummeting confidence in the healthcare institutions. For example, when professional medicine came under attack for ethical oversights in the mid-20th century, a period in which arguments began to emerge that physicians cared too much about the science of disease and too little about the illness of the patients, a modern version of the oath began to appear as part of the graduation ceremonies in medical schools. The oath has an undeniable appeal as a symbol of moral authority, but that symbolism should not be confused with the history of the oath itself. The oath does not, in fact, represent an unbroken historical lineage from the Hippocrates to the modern-day physician, or an ideal passed from generation to generation. It is extremely unlikely, for instance, that the oath even dates from the time of Hippocrates, or that it was composed by anyone close to him. Its inclusion in the Hippocratic corpus likely came from people who compiled his work later. For Galan, however, more obviously Hippocratic examples of ethical practice served his purpose well enough. Though other scholars did include the oath of the Hippocratic corpus, Galan had little reason or inclination to follow their example. Practical healthcare in the Western world. Away from the elite circles of scholarly medicine, most Roman doctors or medici were actually slaves or ex-slaves captured as war prizes or brought up to be trained as the practical healing arts, or in the practical healing arts. The medici were known to be skilled in bone setting. Some surgery, cutting for bladder stones was probably the most common procedure, midwifery, and the preparation and knowledge of medical recipes. Such recipes, or early pharmacology, were one aspect of medicine that showed a great deal of overlap between elite and non-elite types of practice. However, as other words with different scientific meanings today, the term science itself being one example, the term pharmacology should be treated cautiously. The Greek word pharmakon had a meaning associated with healing drugs since antiquity, but the word also had an association with poison. This dual meaning made for a good metaphor, and so we see pharmakon used across Greek writing, especially in drama, philosophy, as a way of expressing ambiguity and uncertainty about the possible harms and benefits of certain things we do in life. The word recipe, too, poses some problems since, as historian Lawrence Totelin notes, in contrast with other ancient languages, such as Chinese, ancient Greek has no specific word for recipe. Totelin uses that word because it is useful and helps orient the modern reader, but does so with caution and notes the anachronistic use of that term. She also provides a working definition of the term in order to better guide her audience, which states the recipe is a written formula for mixing ingredients in culinary, medical, or magical purposes. It lists the items required for making preparations. In her book on Greek medical recipes, Totelin points out that while there is no one text specifically devoted to pharmacology in the Hippocratic writings, there are nonetheless over 1,500 individuals medical preparations or recipes to be found there. Galenic writings are particularly rich in descriptions of compound drugs, that is, preparation composed of multiple ingredients assembled according to a standard recipe, but with room for substitutions and modifications. Again, given that the state of health in the Greco-Roman world was determined by a constellation of factors, place of birth, physical constitution, environmental conditions, and so on, that pertain to any one individual, reputable physicians, a matter of opinion of course, made choices about how to intervene to reduce symptoms and restore the body only after closely observing and interviewing the patient. It was usually practiced then for skilled healers to modify standard recipes in order to tailor medicine to the specific conditions of the illness in any one patient. As in other aspects of his writing, Galan likely borrowed ideas and recipes from other Greco-Roman authors, Hippocrates included, in compiling his lists. By then, the expanding Roman Empire had accumulated a substantial body of new knowledge from cross-cultural encounters and exchanges. Recipes for compound drugs became increasingly elaborate through late antiquity. The compound drug Theriac, for example, was said to have originated in the court of the Persian king Mithridates the Sixth in the 1st century BCE as an antidote for snake bites and other poisons. Mithridates was known to drink theriac every day, terrified as he was of being poisoned. As Porter Riley notes, this may explain why, when the king's son overthrew him and assumed his throne, he had Mithridates stabbed to death instead. By Galen's time, theriac was extremely popular and widely used as a general tonic. Although other Greco-Roman doctors had added to the recipe over the intervening centuries, none did so nearly to the same extent as Galan, who produced a version of the recipe containing a whopping 79 ingredients. Galan may have elaborated on this recipe because he wanted to secure a stronger position for himself and his more active style of practice. As historian Vivian Nutton concisely puts it, Galan reshaped the Hippocratic triangle of doctor, patient, and illness to ensure the doctor's dominance. With respect to medical religious ideas in the Greco-Roman medical marketplace, Galan was picky about what he considered part of the appropriate practice. Like his father, Galan valued the techniques of dream prognostication he learned from his time studying with the Asclepiads. Galan also accepted some aspects of divination, particularly the Greek interpretation of bird divination, which interpreters skilled in the art would observe patterns in the flight of birds to explain circumstances and likely future outcomes. Galan accepted bird divination and ascribed it to a naturalistic cause and effect relationship that made clear its eminent significance to practical patient care. Changes in weather altered the flight of birds, he supposed, and the humoral composition of individuals, and so too their susceptibility to disease. However, Galan opposed astrology as an acceptable part of medical practice, despite the fact that it appeared to offer possibilities for the same kinds of naturalistic, meteorologically based medical indicators that bird divination did. The movement of the stars were widely believed to influence the weather, and several of Galen's medical contemporaries considered astrology a valuable aspect of their practice, perhaps in part due to his efforts to distance himself from magical medicine, something he derided. Galan somewhat arbitrarily decided to draw the line at astrology. Regardless of Galen's condemnation, the practice of astrology persisted as a routine part of medical practice well into the medieval period. And this is likely due to the liminal aspect of astrology, and medical religious medicine in general, at the boundary between natural and supernatural forms of explanation, which could be a useful and appealing bridge between the two for patients and practitioners alike. Slave medicine, the Roman army, and the origins of the Western hospital, valetudinarium. The individualistic focus of the Greco-Roman tradition meant that neither Greek nor Roman society had much in the way of institutions devoted to dealing with the sick, whether rich or poor. One exception to this in Roman life was the valetudinarium, a word that has its roots in the Latin term valetudo, meaning health. The valetudinaria had relatively simple origins as places set aside by wealthy households for sick slaves. Slaves were often highly trained and, as the empire became more pacified, were increasingly difficult and expensive to replace. As time went on, valetudinaria became more popular and more organized. This was particularly the case for the valetudinaria of the Imperial Roman Army, which imported the institution from slave-owning households to the fortresses sustaining long military campaigns. Some larger slave-owning households set aside special rooms called valetudinaria for the medici to take care of the slaves. Nutton notes that the Roman military adopted the system when the need for better fortifications grew as legions crossed the Alps into the unfriendly territories surrounding the Rhine and Danube. Whereas in more placid regions, injured or sick soldiers might have been billeted at nearby towns and villages to be cared for by local families, the northern and western imperial campaigns required new kinds of self-provisioning. The historian Günther Rees argues that as the imperial army became more organized, it became more professionalized. Its once conscripted soldiery transformed into a professional fighting force of career recruits. Therefore, the valetudinaria became an integral institution to the Roman army. It was in this manner that the army hospital was born, albeit brief. When the Roman Empire crumbled, the valetudinaria were abandoned, and it would be some time before any institution like them appeared in the Western world. Because we find more archaeological traces of the military valetudinaria than we do civilian ones, we can guess that perhaps more military than civilian valetudinaria were built. Archaeological evidence suggests that humoral medicine and ideas of miasmatic disease transmission, the idea that disease was caused by miasmas, noxious vapors from decaying plant or animal matter, strongly influenced the architectural design of military valetudinaria. These observations are consistent with the scant textual evidence written by military physicians of the period that survived to become part of the historical record. For instance, there appear to have been a concerted effort to limit the number of patients housed in any one room and to use building techniques to increase natural light and improve ventilation wherever possible, which suggests a mindfulness to the dangers of miasmatic air fouling the atmosphere. Historian Gunter Rees also suggests that both army and slave valetudinaria retain spiritual aspects of healing within the practical functions of the institutions. Modern scholars have found references to prayer and rituals involving the worship of Asclepius and other deities in text and even inscribed on the walls of archaeological ruins. In the practical treatment of acute diseases, such as fevers, the army and slave valetudinaria were likely similar in their use of plant-based medicine. In that sense, the healing practices common to both army and slave valetudinaria were similar to and continuous with the kinds of medicine and healing practiced more generally in the Roman world. One aspect of medical care at an army valetudinarium that likely differed from other kinds of medicine of the time was the range and extent of surgical procedures performed there. A wide range of brass and copper surgical instruments have been unearthed from ancient military sites, and to this archaeological evidence can be added a small collection of first-hand accounts of the kind of procedures surgeons commonly performed. We know, for instance, that wounds were washed, cleaned, salved, bled, and dressed by surgeons, and then carefully watched for signs of healing or corruption. A good flow of white-colored discharge, something surgeons referred to as laudable pus, at around the 5th day of healing was an example of good, healthy progress, for instance. On the other hand, the formation of abscesses and gangrene within a similar time frame was taken as a dire sign that corruption of the wound had begun, and that urgent intervention would be required to try to save the life of the wounded patient. In cases of wound corruption, surgeons applied hot pitch or turpentine to remove the putrid flesh, or else would press a heated iron to the corruption in order to cauterize it away, a technique that was also commonly employed to staunch the flow of blood from a wound. Surgical amputations might have occurred as part of military medicine in the valetudinaria, especially since methods and indications for amputation were discussed at length by several leading scholars of the 1st century. The Roman physician Celsus and the Arab Muslim physician al-Zahrawi al-Casus being two of the most notable examples. Similarly, some of the surgical instruments recovered from archaeological digs might have been employed for purposes of amputation, and some archaeologists have interpreted them as such. In the absence of any mention in the kinds of sources that describe daily or routine practice, however, it is difficult to say how common certain surgical procedures really were. In the case of amputation, for example, it is uncommon to find skeletons from the Roman era that show signs of having had the procedure performed on them. Famous scholars certainly like to associate themselves with daring surgical breakthroughs and frequently mention them in their works, but until historical evidence is recovered, archaeological or textual, to corroborate their claims and to indicate how practical or widespread certain procedures were, it is probably wise to be skeptical about the notion that a mention of groundbreaking discovery in a scholarly text meant that it truly changed much about the routine accepted practices of the period. The Greco-Roman tradition after the fall of the Roman Empire. It is hard to define exactly when the period of Western history that we call antiquity ended, but the decline and fall of the Roman Empire between the early 400s and 476 CE represents a useful historical marker. In the centuries between Galen's life and the fall of Rome, medicine changed very little, and indeed would change little for the next 1,000 years. The decline of the Roman Empire occurred within the context of major geopolitical changes that would shape the historical period known as, in the West, as the medieval period or the Middle Ages, spanning the 10 centuries between the 5th and 15th centuries. These geopolitical shifts were well underway by the time the western part of the Roman Empire collapsed in the mid to late 5th century. The splintering of the western and eastern parts of the empire had occurred almost 200 years earlier. The Greco-Roman tradition in the East and the rise of the Islamic Golden Age. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, which centered on Constantinople, later Istanbul, and Turkey, was not without serious or ongoing conflict. However, with the rise and spread of Islam during the 7th century, the use of a common language, Arabic, helped to unify and stabilize a vast region, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa to Arabia. A new age of intellectual life began to emerge with the blossoming of Arab Islamic scholarship. Historians sometimes refer to this period as the Islamic Golden Age. Like the Greco-Roman tradition, the Islamic Golden Age continued until the decline of the empire, or in this case, caliphate, as Genghis Khan and the Mongol invasions began to destabilize the region in the early 13th century. New Persian wealth created new forms of patronage to support scholarly enterprise in the ancient Persian city of Baghdad, and from the early 9th century on, the city became a global center for the collection and translation into Arabic of vast numbers of Islamic and non-Islamic works, including medical treatises. Medical texts were brought to the city from places as far-flung as India, Egypt, and North Africa, and Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. And it was via this later route that many Greco-Roman works came to be transmitted to the Arab Islamic world. Baghdad itself was a highly cosmopolitan city and one in which Christians, Jews, and Muslims freely mingled. This free intermingling of faiths was critical for the Great Translation Project, since a wide range of language skills were needed, including those of Greek, Syriac, and Sanskrit. Baghdad was also known for its hospital, or Bimaristan, derived from the Persian word meaning house for the sick, an institution that would become widespread across the Arab Islamic world. During the Islamic Golden Age, Arab scholars organized and systematized Greco-Roman writings and knowledge. By synthesizing Greco-Roman interpretations with those from comparable traditions, the Arab, Islamic, Persian, and Jewish traditions in particular, Arab scholars also produced much original scholarship. When medieval humanists translated these hybrid manuscripts into Latin, many of the original contributions by Arab Islamic scholars were adopted and incorporated into the Western tradition without due credit. In this way, not only were novel descriptions of diseases like smallpox, as yet unknown to the Western audiences, introduced into Western medical scholarship, but also were new surgical procedures, cataract surgery, for example, new pharmacological recipes, and new ideas concerning the anatomical makeup of human and animal bodies. Two famous Muslim physicians and philosophers, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, circa 854, circa 925, known to the West by the Latinized form of his name, Razis, and Ibn Sina, circa 980 to 1037, or Avicenna, exemplified some of the most significant aspects of the Islamic Golden Age. Al-Razi spent much of his career at the Baghdad Bimaristan, which is where he wrote many of his 200 or so treatises covering every aspect of the theory and practice of medicine. Following his hero Galan, Al-Razi strived to become the epitome of the scholarly physician, producing many works of philosophy as well as more practical texts on anatomy, diagnosis, pharmacology, and therapeutics, and surgery. Like Al-Razi, Ibn Sina was also a great admirer of Galan, and he too produced hundreds of works on every aspect of medical philosophy, theory, and practice. Of particular interest to Ibn Sina was the theory of the four humors, and his meticulous investigation of the Hippocratic writings on humoral medicine, or more accurately on the Galenic version of this, did a great deal to disseminate the ideas of Hippocrates and other early Greek medical writers to a wide audience of scholars. Interestingly, it was also Ibn Sina's work on Galan and Hippocrates that helped to bolster the status of humoral theory in the West when Arab translations of Greco-Roman texts began to be translated into Latin at European universities during the late medieval and early modern period. The western part of the Roman Empire was not nearly as prosperous or intellectually productive as its eastern neighbor. Pressures arising from the internal conflicts, as well as those stemming from new powers at the eastern border and repeated invasions from the Germanic Vandals and Goths at the northern and western borders, led to the destruction of the Western Roman Empire. Medieval Europe emerged as a patchwork of warring small kingdoms without the shared language, identity, or culture of the emerging Arab Islamic world. One unifying trend did persist amid the chaos of the West, however, and that was the Christian Church. Once vilified by the Roman authorities, Christianity had grown from a small Jewish cult in the early 1st century to becoming one of the imperial religions recognized under Emperor Constantine in 313, and 10 years later it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Despite the turmoil apparent at the end of the Roman Empire, some pockets of the Greco-Roman world continued to flourish intellectually in the 5th and 6th centuries, and nowhere more so than in the North African regions. It was here that early Christian theologians and learned medical scholars produced some of the most important works of late antiquity. At the same time, many ancient Greek texts of philosophy and medicine were translated into Latin, an important development for posterity. Latin would endure as the official language of the Church and of scholarship for the next 1400 years, while knowledge of classical Greek faded almost entirely in Europe. Nevertheless, the scale of translation work in Baghdad dwarfed that of Latin translation, and for this reason most writings on Greek medicine that survive today were preserved from translation into Arabic rather than Latin. It bears repeating that medieval scholars did not simply reclaim Western scholarship from the Arab Islamic tradition. Western medicine did not emerge as an isolated system of thought, or even as one that was particularly successful or original. In the early modern world, just as in the ancient world, the Western tradition existed within, was appropriately from, and co-evolved with a much broader collection of cross-cultural medical traditions. The Greco-Roman tradition in the West and pagan philosophy in Christian thought. Translation of any sort is never just a matter of exchanging words from one language with the same words of another. Our ways of thinking about the world are shaped by the language in which we think, and transmitting this cultural aspect of meaning is difficult work that requires considerable skill and a deep cross-cultural understanding on the part of the translator. The same might be said for other kinds of translation that require transmission of ideas across different kinds of belief systems. For the early Christian church, for example, the most obvious models of healing came from the gospel accounts of the healing miracles of Jesus, miracles that restored the afflicted, or in the case of Lazarus, the dead, to a state of physical and spiritual health, defined by wholeness or holiness. What room was there then for naturalistic and secular, or indeed for other medico-religious interpretations of health and disease within the Christian outlook? This question could probably best be answered with a robust "it depends." That is, it depends on what place and which historical period is under consideration. In general, the Church accepted elements of pagan philosophy, a term used by early Christians to refer to the polytheism of the Greco-Romans, so long as they were appropriately translated into theology of Christian monotheism. The Roman theologian Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430, also known as St. Augustine, was a master translator of this type. Augustine readily incorporated classical Greek philosophy to fit with a monotheistic framework by producing a version of Neoplatonism that effectively replaced Plato's demiurge with a Christian god, one acting like Plato's demiurge, as the creator of a providential planned universe. Augustine's reconciliation of Greek and Christian worldviews, including scholarly writings on medicine, dominated medieval intellectual life. St. Augustine's efforts would be joined by many others, including notably the theologian Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 74, who, like Augustine, was later also elevated to sainthood by the Church. Unlike Augustine, Aquinas focused principally on the writings of Aristotle, translation of whose work had by that time become much more widely available in Latin. As described earlier, for Aristotle, the senses and empiricism more generally were of central importance to investigating the world. Aquinas then had a rather difficult task than the soul-centered speculative writings of Augustine. In emphasizing Aristotelian styles of reason and argument, Aquinas modified Neoplatonism of Augustine to acknowledge that the senses and not just the soul via divine revelation could be used to gain true knowledge about God, the world, and humankind in general. Aquinas thus lent support to projects that aim to discover natural laws for the benefit of all. Augustine and Aquinas became influential thinkers in part because they offered comprehensive answers to the kinds of thorny questions that occupy the attention of the church scholarship during the respective times in which they lived. Each theologian shared the task of reconciling pagan and Christian thought and overlapped in several areas of concern. Augustine's focus on matters of sin, soul, and soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, continued to be important to Christian belief, but by the time of Aquinas, new concerns were added to these enduring ones. Most immediately, the work of Aquinas on Aristotle spoke to some urgent questions then circulating within and between new centers of learning. The universities, from Latin universitas, meaning the whole or the community, established in Italy, France, Spain, and England. The church founded most medieval universities, but monarchs and, as time went on, municipal city authorities were sometimes involved as well. No matter their origin, however, all types of medieval universities were institutions for and of scholasticism, a term that broadly referred to the teaching of ancient philosophy, especially Aristotle, as part of Christian doctrine. The project of reconciling pagan and Christian thought, like that seen in the work of Augustine and Aquinas, was of considerable relevance and so importance to the development of scholasticism, and scholasticism was, in turn, of critical importance to the universities themselves and their effort to be in the exclusive places for professional education. In the medieval sense, the term profession, meaning professing an oath to practice ethically, covered just law, clergy, and medicine, so we should be cautious about viewing the medieval sense of profession with a more modern, inclusive lens. Medieval healthcare institutions. The church, hospitals, and institutionalized philanthropy. Universities were not the only type of new institution beginning to emerge around the 11th century. Hospitals, too, began to appear around this time. The word hospital itself is a creation of medieval Latin and began as a general term applied to houses that received pilgrims, travelers, and strangers. This older use explains why the narrow meaning of hospital that we use today has so many similar sounding variations in words like hostel, hospice, and hospitality. By the late 12th century, the word hospital was coming to designate those places that provided care for the infirm, but critically and specifically as places for the sick poor to come for nursing and alms. This latter aspect is what principally differed between the medical hospitals and the earlier valetudinaria. While the Romans had civic but pragmatic goals in caring for their slaves and soldiers, the medieval church instead looked to hospitals to serve out a kind of corporate piety, or religious duty, and a kind of institutionalized philanthropy or charity, taken from the Latin word caritas, or Christian love. Christian teachings about charity retained and shared many of the earlier Jewish traditions that made care for the poor, orphans, and the sick and needy a part of expected spiritual service and penance. These traditions had little in common with Greco-Roman ideas of public service. The Greco-Roman understanding of philanthropy, from the Greek word meaning a love of humankind, for instance, promoted acts that benefited the social good, but adherence to the values of democracy and equality meant that the good in mind was usually taken to mean that which improved the good of all. The historian Gary Ferguson describes such a concept of philanthropy in terms of its usage in the Hippocratic writings. Rather than encouraging the physician not to cheat or swindle any patient, including a poor one, Hippocratic authors focused on those traits and habits generally recognized as civic-minded. Hippocrates emphasized courtesy and well-mannered kindliness, and as well as the need to avoid harsh words and rash actions. The plight and needs of the destitute, however, are not mentioned. Ferguson is keen to make it clear that this is not a presentist jab at the Hippocratics as much as a means to highlight that the Greco-Romans' view on philanthropy and pity were quite different from the Christian views that followed them. Romans, Furgren says, really saw little need or reason to pity the poor, because the poor had little need of their pity. Pity was better reserved for those of means and status who had experienced some terrible reversal in fortune, because it was those individuals who had tasted the bitterness of loss, unlike the poor, who presumably had nothing to lose. Healthcare and the teachings of the early and medieval church. Aside from a general means to offer public forms of charity, hospitals and the provision of healthcare more generally occupied an important place in the teachings of the early and medieval church. As the influential early theologian Origen 184 to 253 CE put it, God, being all too aware of human frailty and susceptibility to suffering, had sent humanity hope and deliverance through Jesus Christ, a figure, Origen, stylized as the great physician. Origen's theological approach to healing, which held that pain and suffering, physical and spiritual, should be alleviated by any means necessary, was generally influenced by the shaping of theological and doctrinal attitudes. The symbolism of Christ the healer also provided medieval physicians the perfect ideal to fit the needs of the age, and indeed a Christianized version of Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath was held up by scholastic medicine as the practical complement to the spiritual healing of Jesus. At times, Jesus was even referred to as the spiritual Hippocrates in scholastic medieval writings. Medieval hospitals and the influence of Galan. While the rationale and purpose of medieval hospitals may have differed significantly from those of the Roman Veterinaria, the two institutions were quite similar in several other respects. The theory and practice of humoral medicine was a feature common to both, and as the historian Peregrine Horton points out, this was because the dominant type of scholastic medicine in the medieval period was almost exclusively Galenic. While Galan had been part of a tumultuous medical marketplace in his own time, the dominance of the church in medieval life meant that scholastic medicine had few, if any, significant sources of scholarly competition from alternative perspectives, and this would remain the case until the scientific revolution beginning in the 16th century. Like the Veterinaria, medieval hospitals offered medical and surgical remedies for a variety of ailments interpreted within the Galenic humoral tradition and were staffed by attendants for both nursing and spiritual care. The balance between these functions varied, however, and it should not be assumed that the early hospital quickly became a central part of the medical life in the way that it is today. This so-called medicalization of the hospital took place over a long period, and the route to that development was neither simple nor linear. Gordon also notes that the types of sources surviving from any period in history of medicine tend to be those writings by learned physicians with some degree of self-promotion in mind. As discussed earlier, Galan is an outstanding example of how such a dynamic between source and historian can influence how medical history is conceptualized and written, so it is a point worth remembering. Unless historians can learn their lessons and be more rigorous and skeptical in their uses of sources, Horton argues, medical history will continue in its swallowing and regurgitating the narrow self-imposed agenda established by authors such as Galan. That said, the historical record for the history of medicine consists mainly of scholarly accounts, so Horton proposes a different strategy. It's time to look at the sickbed. Doing so is hard. We mostly lack even the case notes of highly educated practitioner, let alone testimony to the clinical behavior of the illiterate healer. The scholastic physicians have, of course, left us a great deal. They wrote Practica on the application of scientific remedies and techniques. They published Concilia, letters of advice to colleagues and distant patients, but neither takes us very far from the realms of theory. These writings are always in some degree self-promotional, designed to show scientia operative, theory in operation, yet unencumbered by individual symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments. of the medieval period generally, Horder writes, the volume of evidence for any sector of the therapeutic world is typically and reliably available in inverse proportion to its relative significance for sick individuals. It's up to historians of medicine, he says, to simply do their jobs better. If historians cannot find new sources, then they must find better methods to do more with the sources that they have. As with the historical investigations of valetudinaria, in the absence of much variation in topic or perspective contained in the written record, historians have looked to partner with other disciplines, notably archaeology, to see what might be gained from an examination of the material record. Medieval hospitals and archaeological evidence. Both written and archaeological evidence points to the widespread medieval popularity of houses or hostels for the sick based around shrines. Shrines in the Christian tradition generally house some holy relic, usually in the form of an object that the faithful regard as possessing miraculous properties, often and especially those of healing. Then, as now, holy relics take a variety of forms, from drops of blood or bone scraps that belonging to dead saints, especially ones martyred for their Christian faith, to things like splinters said to come from the cross used to crucify Jesus, or perhaps pieces of garment worn by him or his family or disciples. Two Christian martyrs, the brothers Damian and Cosmas, deserve particular mention here. Supplanting the pagan Asclepius, Damian and Cosmas became the patron saints of medicine. Brothers living in Cilicia, Asia Minor, around the close of the 3rd century, they became celebrated for their healing powers. Their martyrdom under Diocletian is stirring stuff. Despite being burnt, stoned, crucified, and sawn in half, they survived, perishing only after decapitation. The pair appear in the heraldry of barber surgeon companies, and churches were dedicated to them, often claiming to house their remains in fine reliquaries. Their chief medical miracle credits them with the first transplant. They amputated a white man's gangrenous leg and crafted it in its place that of a dead Moor. In many paintings depicting this scene, the patient with one leg white and one leg black lies supine as the spectators stare awestruck upon the miracle. In other instances, healing shrines would develop around places where miraculous healing was said to have occurred, and again, such beliefs and practices can still be found within the Catholic faith. Based on what we know about the cultural transfer between pagans and Christians, it is likely that older pagan traditions of folk medicine informed and were integrated into Christian healing shrines, but sources to prove this one way or the other are hard to find. Nevertheless, shrine hostels did seem to offer a kind of health care in which both the body and the soul were nurtured, and historian Gunter Rees defends their importance and relevance as institutions of health care. The importance of the provision of food, water, shelter, and nursing care to the sick at shrine hostels, he contends, should not be minimized. Such actions could be as life-saving as any miracle performed as an act of divine intervention. Lazar houses. Christian doctrine that linked the teachings and sufferings of Jesus to the concept of charity and the obligation that all people should aid the needy and show mercy, or else risk God's punishment come the final judgment, served to aid the spread of healing shrines across the medieval West. Places for the care of leprosy, known as Lazar houses, taken from the biblical name Lazarus, a man Jesus miraculously raised from the dead, provide an example of a different kind of hospital, but one that, like the shrine hostel, combined practical care of the temporal body with its principal task of nurturing the eternal soul. While some leper colonies were established in remote areas, Lazar houses were also found along public roads or within towns. In her studies of the many hospitals that dotted England by 1200, historian Cethina Watson addresses this variation in the construction and placement of healthcare institutions. She notes that the populace would likely be familiar with what the hospital was since they were on the busiest streets, besides every meddling town, open to even the lowliest lay person. Unfortunately, the lack of historical record concerning the usual activities of such places renders the precise details of these facilities invisible to modern observers. Watson concludes that it is likely that the functions of the Lazard House and other kinds of hospital significantly overlapped with the functions of the monasteries that typically set them up, with others being founded by townspeople themselves or the regional autocrat. However, exactly how or why institutions were separate remains largely obscure. The Greco-Roman magical religious tradition and Christian belief. Whatever the extent of the practical forms of medicine associated with the new kinds of hospitals, the spiritual and salvific dimensions of these institutions remained the central part of their function and purpose throughout the medieval period. While many scholastic physicians and indeed many theologians saw a seamless relationship between ministry to the body and the ministry of the soul, the health of the soul was nevertheless always paramount. The practical focus of scholastic medicine was not always well regarded by all parts of the church. However, at times physicians faced stern rebuke and even punishment at the hands of their local bishops if their healing practice was too secular or too distracting from the real function of the healer, ministry to the soul. As Horden demonstrates, however, it was common for medieval popes and other senior clergy to employ their own physicians, and so it seems reasonable to suppose that overall the practice of scholastic medicine was held in some esteem by the Church. This potential source of chronic tension over the status of the body with respect to the soul may explain some apparent inconsistencies or reversals of the period. For instance, the Hippocrates had influentially made the case that the sacred disease, epilepsy, like all other diseases, was caused by natural forces. But 1,000 years later, the Western medical tradition was once again filled with the discussion of demons, possession, and the epic struggles of good versus evil at work in the world. Was this a case of history going backwards? Some scholars of the scientific revolution thought so, and then began pejoratively referring to the medieval period as the Dark Ages. Unfortunately, the dismissal of the Middle Ages as backward led many historians to neglect the period, and, until recently, the significant social and intellectual developments of the age were underexplored. That said, medicine, as elsewhere in medieval life, saw the emergence of a new religiously inspired fear of God's wrath. The idea that diseases were brought down to punish individuals and societies, for instance, often made the naturalistic examination of the world difficult for those medieval scholars who engaged in such studies. The history of medicine is filled with examples of such contradictory tendencies, and it is always good to pay attention to how knowledge and practice were affected by these kinds of conditions. Using a letter between family members of the wealthy Italian merchant class, written sometime in the early 1390s, Horden illustrates what such conflicting perspectives look like when applied to a specific case. The letter describes how the wife of Niccolo, one of the correspondents, has information that she thinks will be of interest to the wife of the other correspondent, as they have been trying to unsuccessfully conceive a child. While Niccolo dutifully reports his wife's suggestions and passes along details of how to use the fertility amulet that she had sent, a type of belt, it seems, he nevertheless appears unimpressed and expresses his own opinions on how the matter should be handled. Pregnancy is to be girded on by a boy who is still a virgin, saying first 3 Our Fathers and Hail Marys, Christian prayers, in honor of God and the Holy Trinity and St. Catherine, and the letters written on the back of the belt are to be placed on the belly, on the naked flesh. But I, Niccolo, think it would be better in order if your wife fed 3 beggars on 3 Fridays and did not hearken to woman's chatter. First, Horden notes only woman had a duty to perform in relation to infertility. What role the husband had, if any, is not discussed. He then asks what insight into medieval medicine might be gleaned from this apparently rather chaotic mixture of magical, religious, and medical approaches. As an example, Horden argues that amulets, although long associated with the magical religious tradition, should not be understood as incompatible with Christian piety. According to Horden, it is unlikely that people writing and reading the letter would have seen it that way themselves. The use of medical amulets in the medieval West was widespread because of their ability to be blended with the Christian doctrine, not despite it. Horden explains that the effectiveness of the amulet depended on the writings and speakings of certain prayers that were appropriately Christian in content. The reasoning behind the virgin boy and the contact between the amulet and the naked flesh points towards folk interpretations of fertility, a more blatant example of Christianized magic, perhaps. But again, even here, there does not seem to be any difficulty in accepting such a ritual in the eyes of this pious 14th century family. One of the other letters in this family's correspondence over the infertility episode discusses seeking out a local woman known for putting foul-smelling poultices on the belly, so providing an empirical plant-based remedy. Yet another of the letters contains advice from a learned doctor about what compounds medicines to try. Taken together, these letters demonstrate the medical marketplace of the late 14th century in full swing. As a last point, Horden also notes that for Niccolo, at least, the woman's chatter, presumably referring to the casual exchange of domestic or lay remedies between the woman, and the tinkering with amulets, and indeed the advice of the physicians, was not to be compared to what would likely be effective most for her healing, works of charity and the reception of God's grace in turn. Medieval medicine, from posterity to the Black Death. Scholastic medicine and the status of learned physicians. For learned doctors, the influence of the Church sometimes presented challenges to their practice, but it could also offer opportunities for personal power, prestige, and wealth. As can be seen with the case of the infertile couple described earlier, the medical marketplace was quite active by the late medieval period, and the learned physician might only be one of several types of healer consulted by a single patient over any one case. The patronage of the Church did much to secure the status of the university-educated doctors over the course of the medieval period, and so despite the competition of the marketplace, elite physicians generally fared quite well. The growth of universities. As mentioned earlier, the growth in wealth and in population across the medieval West from around 1200 coincided with the wave of hospital and university building, and of course with the teaching of the profession of medicine was one of the principal functions of the scholastic university, in theory at least. Faculties of some universities tended to be more theologically or clerically oriented than others. The universities of Oxford developed in 1167 and Cambridge around 1209, being prime examples. But some, too, were famously early on for their strength of their medical schools. Salerno, 8th century, was the earliest and most notable university medical school in the medieval West. But other universities such as Bologna, I'm probably saying it wrong, 1158, Montpellier, 1289, and Padua, 1222, all rose to prominence by the mid to late 13th century, and all would become centers of critical importance to the development in medicine that occurred as part of the scientific revolution. While at university, all students, no matter their desired final choice of profession, were required to pass through a 7-year curriculum covering the liberal arts, all of which were taken from the Greco-Roman tradition: arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, musicology, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Greco-Roman influences not only impacted the content of the curriculum, but also the form of scholastic education. Books were few and didactic lectures were common. And to graduate as a bachelor or master of the arts, all students were required to show skills in oral presentation, verbal disputation, and dialectical reasoning. These were all qualities that, from the Greco-Roman standpoint, ensured a candidate could enter civil society as a free, equal, and contributing member. Upon graduating from university, a student desiring to enter medical practice might engage in practical studies of animal or human dissection, a limited amount of which was allowed at several universities, and or work under the supervision of a senior doctor for a few years. Some universities had offered advanced degrees in medicine, and some did not. But the advanced degree was not the key characteristic of the learned physician of the medieval era. The cultural physician was characterized by a mastery of philosophy, not by the possession of an MD or other form of medical doctorate. Ironically, Galen's philosophies lay at the heart of the advanced learning for physicians, but his text did not. Had he lived to see it, though, Galen probably would have approved wholeheartedly the education of would-be physicians. As historian Roy Porter puts it, the ability to reason and cite chapter and verse raised the true physician above the empiric. The university-trained physician, upon completion of his or her studies, some women did attend and even teach at medical universities, but the profession was mostly male-dominated, might go to work in a large city where wealthy patients lived or else might seek out employment in a prominent household. Porter relates the reported duties of the physician to the English king Edward III, 1312-77, as follows. As much he should talk with the steward, chamberlain, the sewer, and the maester cook, to devise by counsel what meats and drinks is best according with the king. Also him ought to espy if any of his court be infected with leprous or pestilence, and warn the sovereigns of him, till he be purged clean, to keep him out of court. In other words, looking after the diet of the king and taking care to closely observe him and his court for the signs of disease were principal duties of the physician to the king's court. Both kinds of activities were eminently Hippocratic, of course. The use of Galenic therapies. As discussed earlier, Hippocratics tended to rely more on diet and lifestyle changes to restore the body to a balanced state of health, but Galen, for whom the four-humor theory was more central, devised elaborate compounds of various substances to try to force the body back into a balanced state. In Galen's model, bodies became ill when one of the four humors circulating the body became too dominant or too concentrated in one part of the body. Therefore, Galen's therapeutics often depended on controlling the levels and amounts of these various fluids. One of the primary therapies in Galen's healer's arsenal was bloodletting, which used a lancet to cut open a vein in the arm or leg to remove what was considered to be excess blood. Another common set of techniques, known as purging and puking, were devised to control the levels of black and yellow bile in the body. Purges were given with the intention of opening the bowels, and while they were sometimes administered orally, more typically an enema or a clyster pipe would be inserted into the anus of the patient, through which a bag of fluid could be squeezed and delivered directly into the cavity of the rectum. Puking, as the name suggests, employed herbs that were chosen for their emetic qualities. That is, they were known to bring about emesis or vomiting when ingested. Within all three practices there existed elaborations and variations, but the principles of the practice, humoral and Galenic, stayed the same. In the medieval practice of cupping, for instance, a small glass bowl or cup was sated over a flame, and they would be placed on the skin of the patient, or they would rapidly cool, forming a vacuum and sucking at or cupping the flesh. This treatment, at least in Western interpretations, derived from the principles of bloodletting, in that the process of cupping was thought to draw out humoral excess, but with the exception, of course, that no cutting was required and the actions were local to the area to which the cups were applied. The application of leeches to patients, which rose in popularity during the Middle Ages, was also based on the principles of bloodletting. The use and storage of leeches in beautiful vase-like leech jars would be a common feature of fashionable medical paraphernalia that practitioners collected in the late 18th century. Otherwise, the practice of academic physicians generally followed Hippocratic principles in paying close attention to a patient's personal medical history before forming a diagnosis, to which might be added a limited amount of physical examination. The taking of the pulse with the fingers was the most widely performed physical examination. Theories of the pulse and the practice of pulse-taking were Galenic additions to the Western tradition, but they were also widely practiced across different global medical traditions. Another common form of physical diagnosis was uroscopy, which involved visual inspection of urine to look for evidence of pus, blood, and changes in color and turbidity, as well as taste inspections, to check for signs of sweetness and any other aspects of the urine that might indicate disease. The practice of uroscopy was also widespread across different geographic regions in global medicine, but scholastic medicine most likely borrowed it from the Arab Islamic tradition. The role of mathematics. One major difference between the practice of humoralism in the Middle Ages and Galen's use of humoralism was the addition of mathematical patterns. Scholastic authors generally loved mathematics. The practical application of mathematics to the patterns of disease in the individuals, such as the frequency and periodicity of the fevers during an illness, was based on Hippocratic accounts, but greatly expanded during the Islamic Golden Age before being retransmitted to Europe. The influence of astrology. Following the emphasis of the Arab Islamic tradition, astronomy and mathematics were both taught as part of the general scholastic education, and the medieval developments of medical astrology were extensive. As we have mentioned, Galan was no fan of astrology. His expanded theory of the four humors drew correspondences with the earthly seasons. Spring was associated with blood, summer with the yellow bile, fall with black bile, and winter with phlegm. Okay. The same humors were later tied to human personality types: sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic, respectively. A learned doctor needed to know all these correspondences between the four humors and the broader world to assess what conditions a patient was most likely to experience and when, again reflecting the concern with the parallel between the microcosm and macrocosm. Scholastic physicians merged their observed correlation with existing literature from the medico-religious traditions of astrology in order to form a rational astrology based in humoral principles and the perceived connection between planetary bodies and earthly ones, and the humors and organs. As Porter makes clear, however, while mainstream in many ways as an area of practice, medical astrology could be a risky career path in the Middle Ages. The Church was particular about what kinds of magical practices were acceptable, something the English physician and monk John of Toledo learned the hard way when he was jailed for necromancy, communicating with the dead to predict the future, in the 1240s. Medieval surgery. Finally, as had been the case in previous eras, the practice of surgery in the medieval world was often done within a military context. University-educated physicians serving kings and noblemen during medieval European conflicts and the various crusades wrote most of the surgical treatises that survive from the period. In terms of content, the surgical treatises were recognizably Galenic in their discussion of theory, but contained increasingly numerous additions from the Arab Islamic world as time went on. They were concerned with many of the same issues that concerned the Roman surgeons within the imperial army. What was the best means to bring on the laudable puss? Should the wound be kept wet or as dry as possible? When and how should cautery be applied? Apothecaries, surgeons, and the formation of guilds. As the medieval population grew and the cities became wealthier in the 13th century Europe, medical practitioners began to form organizations to protect their interests more effectively, which usually meant an attempt to exert some influence over the medical marketplace. While some local jurisdictions, usually related to the church, offered licenses to practice medicine and promised punishments to those who practiced without them, the enforcement of medical licensings did not gain traction until the late 16th century. In other parts of the medical marketplace, though, practitioners formed guilds to reduce competition between their members and to pass on and preserve trade secrets. Druggists or apothecaries were generally the first to create medical guilds. The Latin word apotheca means storehouse, and apothecaries would buy herbs and other medicaments in bulk from traders and prepare or compound them to sell in quantities or potencies suited to each customer or physician request. In numerous instances, local surgeons joined the apothecaries to form joint guilds. What professional interests would surgeons and merchant apothecaries have in common? One significant reason for the professional collaboration between surgeons and apothecaries was the influence of academic physicians in the medical marketplace. The academic, university-educated physician was accorded a higher status than the instrument-wielding, craft and skill-oriented surgeon, and over time the study of surgical texts and then surgeons themselves were pushed out of medical schools and into lower-class guilds instead. It would take centuries for professional surgery to recover the ground lost during the medieval period. In large part, surgery had to wait until the 18th century, when the context of healthcare shifted once again towards a growing focus on anatomy, and humoral medicine declined in influence. Another explanation for the alliance between apothecaries and surgeons lies in the nature of the marketplace. While today's physicians write prescriptions for ready-made medications, which a pharmacist fills and dispenses for each patient, medieval apothecaries served much broader functions. At apothecary shops, not only could patients purchase medical compounds without the need to first consult a physician, but they could also seek medical advice and diagnostic consultation there. Furthermore, skilled apothecaries carried a diverse range of ingredients, including spices, herbs, nuts, oils, and resins. While these substances all typically had medical applications, many of these products were also used for industrial applications. This broad medical practice in apothecary shops could be further supplemented by working along surgeons, so many surgeons and apothecaries helped each other to earn a living. In other areas, too, cooperation was the key to getting a market share. In the case of barber-surgeon guilds, for example, surgeons would offer services alongside barbers who, in addition to providing a shave and a haircut, were also often well practiced in the art of bloodletting. The Black Death and Epidemic Plague. The major cities of 14th century Europe were prosperous and sophisticated places, possessing highly developed cultures in the arts and letters. They were also unimaginably filthy and crowded. In October 1347, the first reports emerged of the arrival of the plague to the island of Sicily, imported by ill sailors crewing Genoese galleys. The outbreaks reported at Sicily were quickly joined by other reports from the port authorities at Messina, Genoa, and Venice. By the year of 1348, the plague had spread across Italy, and by spring across France, Spain, and Portugal. It had crossed the English Channel to Britain by the summer of 1348, and by the end of the year it had reached across the North Sea to Germany and Scandinavia. That the plague spread so quickly and so widely across Europe is a testament to the continent's interconnectedness and especially its prosperity in trade. Europe was united by ports and crisscrossed by trade routes and regional marketplaces. Medieval Europe was also regularly embroiled in war. Each of these factors contributed to the terrifying breadth of the disease outbreak in 1347. The Genoese vessels that had originally introduced plague to the shores of Western Europe had likely brought it there from Crimea, on the eastern part of the continent, where, months before, Italian mercenaries in the employ of wealthy merchant families had fought bitter and protracted battles with the Tartars over access to the Great Silk Road trade route. The plague itself had probably arrived in Crimea via the Silk Road from Central Asia, where significant plague outbreaks were recorded throughout the mid-1330s and 1340s. Modern-day investigations into the plague. For centuries after it struck, the Black Death captivated scholars not only for its ferocity, but for its mystery. What could have possibly caused such a catastrophe? These investigations picked up steam, especially after the germ theory of disease suggested that there should be a singular identifiable microbial culprit. Despite the new lab techniques for isolating microorganisms developed throughout the 20th century, the plague germ remained unidentifiable until DNA extraction techniques pioneered in the 1990s found that a bacterium named Yersinia pestis was the cause of the bubonic plague. This new technique triggered a wave of high enthusiasm for historical microbe hunting that lasted through the early 2000s. Such projects in retrospective diagnosis have become considerably less popular in more recent years. In part, retrospective diagnosis has become less popular as part of a routine settling down of a once hot research agenda and the inevitable arrival of newer, more fashionable methods. But historical diagnosis has also faltered because historians have raised objections about the purpose and value of such methods. Historians' chief complaint is that such work describes a reality that people in the past never really experienced directly. Medieval people never understood their suffering that way, so the conclusions that can be drawn about the experience of the plague necessarily limited. By claiming access to some true version of the past by identifying and labeling a pathogen found in the remains of a person who might have been a plague victim, the activities of retrospective diagnosis miss the point of historical inquiry. Whether or not the Black Death and the plagues that followed were really caused by the organism identified centuries later as Yersinia pestis, or were really anthrax or pneumonic plague, or some combination of pathogens, is an interesting but limited question. More sophisticated discoveries and methods of bioarchaeology have been developed so that they can move beyond the strictly laboratory approach that typified research in the 1990s to intersect biological inquiries with historical perspectives. Today, historians and social scientists are interested in plague as a human experience. What must it have been like to attempt to control it in the face of overwhelming odds and destruction? Biological data can assist in answering parts of such questions, including why the Black Death spread so far and killed so quickly in some places but not others, but biological data cannot and should not replace the human questions as the primary focus of historical investigation. Rather than quibble over modern definitions of century-old organisms, historians like Paul Slack have instead thought about what made plague to the people who lived through it, and how they recognized outbreaks and how they responded. According to Slack, two features are common in descriptions of plague in recorded history. The first distinguishing feature is the speed of the spread and shocking mortality rates. During the time of the Black Death and the epidemic waves that followed, it was not unusual for more than 30% of the population to die within a year. The second feature that characterizes historical accounts of plague are terrified and terrifying narratives of suffering and fear. The more elaborate descriptions, most of them surviving from the 14th century onwards, commonly refer to the extreme delirium, fever, and painful tumors of the sick, and to the putrid matter issuing from their sores, mouths, and nostrils, which could contaminate anybody nearby. Their breath is so stinking, one French physician recorded in 1666, that it is virtually intolerable. Thus the common proverb in French is true: one smells of plague. Easily sensed and identified, polluting whole cities that caused of private suffering and collective disaster has, since the at least 6th century AD, been given the same name: plague or pestilence, pestis in Latin, and sometimes the plague or the pestilence. Violent responses to the plague. In some instances, this fear and suffering turned outward as spite, rage, and violence. There are numerous sources describing episodes of horrific persecution directed at communities of European Jews in 1348 and 1349, for instance, which can indicate that the Black Death was the major instigating factor for the attacks. In other words, medieval Jewish pogroms were justified by accusations that Jews had deliberately spread plague and poisoned the wells, and the public reaction to such rumors were deadly. In 1349, approximately 1,000 Jews were burned alive in the city of Strasbourg alone. Numerous other sources describing traveling bands of penitents, and flagellants who wandered the towns and countryside, beating and whipping themselves as punishment for the global sins they thought that had inspired the divine retribution that was the plague. The penitents cried out for others to repent too, and they said it would be the only means to save the world from this apocalyptic disaster. Should we assume from these sources that the Black Death ushered in a period of hysteria, hyper-religiosity, and narrow-minded violence? Eyewitness accounts of the Black Death, even these semi-fictionalized ones that we find in the plague survivor Giovanni Boccaccio 1330 to 1375 masterpiece, the Decameron, completed around 1353, give the modern reader cause enough to shudder. Such was the cruelty of heaven and to a great degree of man that between March 1348, and the following July, it is estimated that more than 100,000 human beings lost their lives within the walls of Florence. What with the ravages attendant on the plague and the barbarity of the survivors towards the sick. In Siena, father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another. None could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. They died by the hundreds, both by day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. At first glance, accounts like this seem to provide strong evidence for the type of social and moral breakdown Thucydides had described centuries earlier. After all, Boccaccio was almost certainly familiar with Thucydides' account of the plague of Athens. Indeed, the social breakdown of Europe during and after the plague used to be the consensus among historians. Early 19th century German medical historian J.F.C. Hecker famously described the Black Death as a mental shock to all nations and one without parallel and beyond description. It destroyed confidence in the future, undermined deference and conventional moral norms, produced extremes of religious enthusiasm and social and religious dissidence, turned everything upside down. Slack, however, rejects the idea that civilization broke down, proposing instead that Hecker and other 19th century historians of the Black Death were influenced by the horror they saw as waves of epidemic cholera swept through Europe during their own time. As Slack notes, the immediacy and pain of first-hand accounts of plague outbreaks tended to fade in urgency quickly as populations began to recover. Therefore, it is difficult to gauge the extent and duration of the moral and psychological damage caused by the plague. The consequences for those who died, either as a result of disease or, like the Strasbourg Jews, as a result of violence, were very real. But to what extent such events caused permanent shifts in mentality is hard to answer. Slack is even cautious about seemingly obvious examples of change, like the religious fervor expressed by the flagellants. His work shows that far from approving of the moral and spiritual panic incited by spectacles of penitence, church authorities were appalled by such indulgent and unsanctioned acts happening in their jurisdictions. Flagellant processions and murderous campaigns against the Jews were unfortunately common before the Black Death and remained common after. The period of the Black Death likely rationalized and precipitated certain acts, but that is not to say that it was what caused them. Socioeconomic impacts of the plague. Other effects of the Black Death are easier to discern historically. In places where church authorities had strong influence, there tended to be records of births, marriages, and deaths. These records provided historians with a guide, albeit an imperfect one, for estimating total deaths from the plague across particular regions and periods. The first 2 waves of the plague, 1347 to 1352, and then 1360, cut the European population by 1/3, and the population remained low for the next 100 years. Fewer laborers meant that skilled labor became more valuable and expensive for employers, meaning workers could both demand higher wages and be more selective about where they worked. Many of the most lucrative opportunities were in cities, and as so many houses and occupations there had become empty. Ultimately, the rising powers of laborers tilted the centuries-old balance of power between lord and peasants, enabling new levels of social and geographic mobility. Yet, it would be an exaggeration to say that the Black Death caused the collapse of the feudal system. Whether a region experienced a redistribution of wealth and power in the wake of the plague or not, was strongly influenced by local social and economic conditions that were in place before the disease arrived. Nevertheless, increased social mobility among the underclass contributed to new ways of thinking about the world as Europeans entered the early modern era. The plague's effect on late medieval medicine. The activities of human societies changed the social and biological conditions of existence, and in the case of the plague in the mid-14th century, the confluence of social and biological conditions was just right for a catastrophic outbreak of disease. However, we should exercise caution against what Slack calls great disaster interpretations of history, in which commentators assume that a past crisis must have changed the course of history, and that without it, things would have likely turned out differently. Slack argues that analyzing catastrophic events reveals how robust and adaptable humans can be. The Black Death of the 1340s initiated a period of epidemic plague outbreaks in Europe that lasted into the 18th century. One major way in which the plague affected late medieval medicine, though by practitioners' own admission, medieval medicine had little effect on the plague, was its exposure of the limits to the individualistic approach to health and disease enshrined within the Greco-Roman tradition of scholastic medicine. Don't ask why I'm messing up words like this. Church and civic authorities offered few, if any, organized responses to the plague, and university-trained physicians offered even fewer, though the basic structure of quarantine was outlined. Still, it would be another several hundred years before groundwork was laid for the basic structure of public health, and further still for robust scientific theories of contagion. In the intervening time, plague remained unique, both in its mystery and its devastation. And finally, that is the end of section 2, and I completely regret doing this again, but I'll probably still end up doing section 3.